Salutations everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Jackson, and today I'm going to be delving into a rather fascinating topic regarding the New Testament, that being the Christology of the Gospel of Mark. Now, because all of these terms may not be familiar to all of our listeners, I would like to briefly define some of them. Now, the term Christology refers to the theology of Christ, or Jesus, and so one might say they have a high Christology, or a high view of Jesus in their theology, or a lower Christology, a lower view of Jesus in their theology. Now, the other term that I will define is the term gospel, which in this case, though not every case, it is defined as one of the accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. In the New Testament, there are officially 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with most scholars agreeing that Mark is the earliest of these Gospels, which is the one I will be addressing today. Now, for context, many critical scholars will argue that the early Christians did not actually believe that Jesus was God, and believed that they had a lower Christology, perhaps seeing Jesus as a religious or political figure. No, I'm not going to use any technical words at this point because that would just add more confusion and I would have to define more things, but that's not the focus of this video. So, they argue that the Gospel of Mark, being the earliest Gospel, indicates this, and indicates that they did not initially believe that Jesus was God, but that the idea that he was divine was an accretion, or something that developed over time. They argue that the Gospel of John, they often argue, that is, that the Gospel of John is the culmination of this, and that it has a far higher Christology than Mark did. However, I've come to contend with that and make the point that the Gospel of Mark, being the earliest Gospel, taught Jesus was and is God just as much as the Gospel of John might have, and perhaps even more explicitly so. With that said, let's dive right into it, beginning in Mark chapter 1. Now, in verses 1 through 3, it states, "In the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, Make ready the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." Now, this passage in the Old Testament is in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. It reads, "A voice is calling, prepare the way for Yahweh in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for our God." So we see in Isaiah chapter 40 that somebody is preparing the way for Yahweh. Now, Yahweh is the personal name of the God of Israel, who is the creator of heaven and earth, who is transcendent above all, and who is the only true God who created all other gods and beings. He is above all. That is what the scripture indicates. And I can go into that in another video if need be. But we see that someone is preparing his way, preparing the way for the God of Israel, the creator of all. And then in the New Testament, it quotes that verse again, and then goes on to describe who is preparing the way for Yahweh. Let us look at the text again. So someone cries out in the wilderness, making ready the way of the Lord. In the Old Testament text, that was Yahweh. And then, after that, John the Baptist appears in the wilderness in verse 4. And he's preparing the way for Yahweh. Yet, it later shows that the one he's preparing the way for is Jesus. He speaks of one coming who is mightier than I. He's speaking of the one who comes after him. And then it says, "Now it happens in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan." And so the one who came after John was Jesus of Nazareth. But wasn't John preparing the way for Yahweh? Well, yes. And so I would argue that this text indicates that Jesus himself is Yahweh. So we see that even in the first few verses of the book of Mark, it seems that it is insinuating that Jesus himself is Yahweh, the God of Israel, creator of heaven and earth, who is above all others. So that is quite fascinating, I would argue. Now, continuing on, in Mark chapter 4, there is a passage that also seems to indicate his divinity in the context, when referring back to the context of the Old Testament. Let us take a look. In Mark chapter 4, verses 38 through 39, it reads, "And Jesus himself was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. And they got him up and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Silence, be still.' And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm." Now in verse 37, it states that, quote, "And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling up." So at this point, the disciples are in the midst of a rather tumultuous storm, and they cry out to Jesus in terror because of said storm. And Jesus silences the wind and the waves and causes perfect calm. But this again seems to reference an Old Testament passage that indicates something about his identity. In Psalm 107, verses 28 through 29, it says, "Then they cried to Yahweh in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He caused the storm to stand still, so that its waves were hushed." So, in Mark chapter 4, we see a rather interesting parallel to the Old Testament psalm, Psalm 107. In Psalm 107, those being mentioned are crying out to Yahweh, the God of Israel. And then he calms a storm, he calms the waves. And yet, in Mark chapter 4, we see that the apostles, just like those in the psalm, cry out, but this time to Jesus. And then Jesus calms the wind and the waves. He calms a storm, just as Yahweh does in the psalm, indicating perhaps that Jesus is, in fact, Yahweh, through parallelism with the Old Testament psalm. Furthermore, we do see that Jesus appears to do this by his own prerogative, rather than by calling on the name of the Lord or asking for the Lord to calm the wind and the waves. He appears to do it by his own authority, which again indicates that it's he who is Yahweh. Continuing to the next chapter in Mark, there's another interesting thing that Jesus does that indicates that he may be more than merely a man. We see in verse 35 of chapter 5 of Mark that a man's daughter had passed away. Earlier in the passage, she was ill, and he had come to get Jesus to heal her, but she had passed away. And then in verse 41, Jesus says to her, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the little girl stood up and began to walk, is how verse 42 begins. So Jesus raised this girl from the dead. However, don't Old Testament prophets raise people from the dead? Doesn't that just indicate that Jesus is at most a prophet? That does not necessarily indicate that he is God, correct? Well, I would like to make the distinction that, unlike the prophets in the Old Testament, Jesus appears to do this once again, like in the last passage, by his own authority. When we see Old Testament prophets raising people from the dead, we see them praying to the Lord, and he raises them after the prophets have prayed to him. A key example of this is in 1 Kings chapter 4, or rather 2 Kings chapter 4. Apologies for the misunderstanding. In verses 32 to 34, it says, "Then Elisha came into the house, and behold, the boy was dead and laid on his bed. So he entered and shut the door behind them both, and prayed to Yahweh. And he went up and lay on the child, and put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hand on his hands. And he stretched himself on him, and the flesh of the child became warm." Verse 35 states, "Then he returned and walked in the house once back and forth, went up and stretched himself on him, and the boy sneezed 7 times, and the boy opened his eyes." So Elisha, in this passage, does not merely tell the boy to get up by his own authority, but rather he prays to Yahweh, and then Yahweh heals the boy. Unlike Jesus, who appears to do this by his own authority, merely telling the girl to get up. Now, Jesus' prerogative in Mark chapter 5 appears very parallel to the prerogative of the God of Israel in the Old Testament, to raise the dead by his own authority, rather than being parallel to the prophets who prayed to the God of Israel to raise people. And so, once again, it indicates that Jesus is more than a mere prophet, but perhaps is himself the Lord. Now, there are a few other places in Mark wherein Mark appears to treat Jesus as divine or God, whether it's using a divine title, such as the Son of Man, or in the event of the Transfiguration. However, those events and titles are especially complex and would take quite a bit of background to elucidate how they show Jesus as God. I do not have time in this video, unfortunately, to go into that, so I will save that for another video. However, if you wish to learn more about that, there are some channels such as YHWH and Inspiring Philosophy, run by Michael Jones, which go more in depth into those particular things. So if you wish to look into that on their channels, that would be rather helpful, perhaps. Now, with that said, there is one primary objection that some have made to Jesus' divinity within the Gospel of Mark. So I am going to address that right now. In Mark chapter 10, a man comes to Jesus and says, quote, "Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" End quote. In the next verse, Jesus says to him, quote, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." Now, the question that some have raised is, if Jesus is asking why the young ruler is calling him good, and seemingly and saying that no one is good except God alone, then would not Jesus be separating himself from God? Well, some have argued that that is not the most plausible reading of the text, especially in light of the rest of Mark. Some have argued, rather, that Jesus is correcting, or at least inquiring about, this rich young ruler's notions. He says, "Good teacher," and Jesus is saying, "No one is good except God alone." It appears that Jesus is correcting his notion that if Jesus is a mere teacher, he could be good, because there is none good except God. Thus, he would not necessarily be separating himself from God as much as he is pointing out an inconsistency between calling Jesus a mere teacher and calling him good, because again, there is none good except God alone. So, in summary, it appears that, despite the arguments of some, throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is in fact portrayed as divine, and there is quite a high Christology in Mark, a quite evident high Christology, perhaps even on the same level as the Gospel of John, which may be addressed in another video. So, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed the video, I hope you learned something, and of course, I'd love to hear your feedback. So, if you have any rebuttals, questions, or just anything else, please put it in the comments, and I'll attempt to read it as soon as I am able. Providential blessings. Have a wonderful day.